Being well behaved is no virtue. Has anyone ever told you that you're a bad person? Has anyone told you to your face, nobody likes you? Now, whether or not you actually did something that warranted that response is irrelevant. What really matters is what incentivized someone to proclaim that. We'll start with the first premise. What makes someone a good person? To a lot of people, they only ever really think of this question to a superficial degree. Being good to your average person, your normie, if you will, is either one or a combination of the following traits: being a law abiding citizen, following rules or mandates from an arbitrary authority. This means your boss, teacher, preacher, or even a peanut gallery coworker or colleague. Putting other people's needs or expectations before your own and complying with any tacit barometers of social normalcy to not rock the boat, rendering everyone's collective discomfort. The reason why people have these nearsighted conceptions of a virtuous person is either because someone is afforded the luxury to not deeply consider these thoughts, or they are so downtrodden in a survival mode bias, they blindly make a virtue out of their subordinates. What a lot of people conflate as good is an illusion. Complacency and compliance is the masqueraded virtue of normies. Social goodness is often what people sanction, often anointing their fragility. Structurally, the bedrock behind this is power dynamics, hierarchies, systems of control that leverage these implicit norms to gain leverage. For millennia, people have outsourced their purpose, their sense of self, their morality to these institutions that give them a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. These institutions again vary: schools, churches, government, corporations, all of these entities exist for one purpose: to nullify the individual autonomous agent, which is why you have people who are what I call internal bureaucrats. We'll bring up the Nietzschean idea of the last man, who is a subordinate to these herds. In order to tackle the smorgasbord of entities that impose their arbitrary authority, we must tackle the epitome of the structural tenet holding Western culture's arbitrary valuation ever prescient. When examining the valorization of suffering, a central figure must be invoked: Yaldabaoth. This is a fundamental building block of how the Western imperial system of valuation maintains itself. This omnipotent figure of Christendom is the epicenter of milieu that facilitates the barometer of ethics an average normie has. And to address the obvious, your hegemonic normie in the West identifies as white, adheres to tacit enculturated norms, which is why they often are Western centric, adhere to consumer curated stratums of identity, adhere to heteronormativity, adhere to hierarchies, etc. This uniformity is no coincidence, being the cultural and systemic default. Thus, they have the privilege to never deeply consider the core quandaries of this video. In Christendom, the main principles prioritized within its faith are obedience, submission, and mercy. Now, there have been many videos addressing the problems with Christianity. We're going to paraphrase proto anti SJW Gamergate skeptic community bullshit. Obedience is favored because it is the perfect authority deference to prevent accountability towards an often corrupt authority's actions. Submission is for people to venerate their mistreatment and suffering. Mercy to again prevent the oppressive force from actually taking accountability, also passing on the gradual resentment that will come when someone is continually abused. With all these combined, is it really any wonder blind devotion to these concepts has led to some of the worst atrocities in history? Even with the context of the time frames of these archaic doctrines that internal bureaucrats launder their selfhood into, when you read the good book, can you actually, in intellectual honesty, say there's anything good that is being done to the people in it? Like Genesis 22 verses 2, Numbers 31 verses 17 through 18, Deuteronomy 22 verses 28 through 29, Judges 21 verses 10 through 12, etc. This is the manuscript your average uninitiated internal bureaucrat gets their valuation, something that is entirely mandated and evidently not well thought out. Whenever this overt contradiction is confronted, it is met with the tried and true recursive apologia with Heilicks, claiming you are just misunderstanding the good book. which perfectly illustrates the slave moralist conundrum. Any shattering of their necessary illusion will warrant use of shame, social ostracization, which is crucial to the herd's functionality. This is also why the narcissist, when you look at their pathology, is really just a radical normie. I have no intention of relegating this video purely to dissecting the obvious faultiness of Abrahamism, nor is it the only form of mass appealing apparatus. Like I mentioned earlier, we have multiple entities that use the enculturated norms of Christendom as a spine to incentivize people to be good. This is the primary mechanization behind Christendom, and even why these institutions are fused, creating a comorbidity of control. Religious private schools, religious media, theocracies that we see the West progressively leaning toward, all systems meant to arbitrate people's conception of what it means to be good. They indoctrinate men, women, children, people into these belief systems that instill the obedience chip. Morality rooted in this stringent obedience metric is not just tied to religion. What I've been clarifying is that a large chunk of people's moralistic ontology is tied to it, whether they'd like to admit it or not. You see these obedience arbitration systems even in secular environments when people make what should be a recognition of basic human rights some performative hall monitor policing, where power is demonized as being evil or bad, which again is rooted in Abrahamic conditioning that you're a bad person for putting your sovereignty, ambition, or goals above the collective. Right there, exactly what I said could be taken out of context by someone like this. What I said could be demonized by the peanut gallery herd appealer as some glorification of narcissism or sociopathy, which is more often than not a shadow projection that I'll divulge later in the video. Individuation is shunned by these structures that arbitrate people's conception of goodness on the feared straw man outside of that arbitrary barometer. Some of the best artists we've had in decades were people who had to individuate and seek solitude in order to cultivate talent. To an average person, that'd be deemed selfish because they operate in a collectivized basis of identity. These arrangements all instrumentalize that condition control to incentivize the samsaric carrot on a stick, social mobility, steady living situation, the American dream, marriage, kids, etc. It is the crux of why religion is an opiate to the masses. The people do good for the incentive of going to the good afterlife. All of this is by design and appealing usually to the lowest common denominators, which includes flyover state folk. Frederick T. Gates wrote in 1913, "We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. The task is simple. We will organize children and teach them in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way." A sentiment that would later be substantiated by his mentor, John D. Rockefeller, who constructed the infrastructural, cultural, and academic layout of the Western machine, where this illusory ploy of being good is regimentation. Substantiating the designation of human worth in the systems of arbitration that now I'll refer to as abattoirs is the illusory ploy of meritocracy. Meritocracy enables the internal bureaucrat to use survivorship bias to further gaslight, alienate, or deflect in order to mask any doubt within the herd. Meritocracy doesn't actually incentivize innovation. It is the weaponization of normality using people's collective loosh to contribute to the abattoir. Any objective acknowledgement of the system's errors, inequality, or contradictions will be met with dismissal, often from the average normie, who has the privilege or is unempathetic enough to assume that the just world fallacy is reality, that you don't have enough merit, even when you could be ahead of them in their department. What really matters to the abattoir is a systematized individual who runs their prompt. Have you ever blindly done something because someone told you to? Have you ever worked somewhere taking the job mainly because word went around about it? Most people operate in this modem of thought. They do something because they are told to or are recommended, blindly going along with it. This is how traditions, pressures, and generational curses come about. Now, What exactly are the implications of this? What do you get when a vast collective of people have surrendered their autonomy in order to buy into these larger scripts, the abattoir? You get people who've dissociated from their very essence. This right here is where the foundational danger comes, and what we've repeatedly see play out historically, what should have been cautionary tales. What do you get when people have outsourced their sense of self, but their morality to an arbitrary structure? You get collectivized shadow, which is what the average good person sublimates their normality policing into, whether they like to acknowledge it or not. That lack of acknowledgement, outright denial usually, is what makes it so odious. Now it has a moralized edge. Mirroring the contradictions will usually elicit a passive aggressive response or outright hostility because the illusion they grasp is fractured. Depersonalization is how people get to a point psychologically that they are willing to commit any atrocity simply because enough collectivized initiative and someone telling them it's okay to do so. The average person doesn't want to think they'd be the person burning witches at the stake, buying people, or committing mass murder, but the uncomfortable truth is most would out of sheer compliance and in the right circumstance. That's why internal bureaucrats are not good, because most of that virtue is conditional. That's why the person who was laughing at that emo kid, the Make Israel Great Again hick who called an immigrant out of their name, the Christian who clutched their rosary at a queer person, the liberal, puritanically moralizing speech trying to control your behavior, and so on are not good. That is why I say individuation is monumental to escaping the prison of so called virtue. That thought process of focusing on yourself can be twisted as some solipsistic narcissism, which was the core blind site within Nietzsche's work. Thing was, narcissism had not been coined with an empirical psychological study during his period, so prophetic as he was, he could not have foreseen certain narcissistic idiots who, like the drastic normies they have always been, will literalize and conflate power with purely material means such as domination, cruelty, and subjugation, which all Hylics do. A narcissist is just the end-stage normie in that collective shadow depersonalized hyperconformist mode to evade moral accountability, like we saw with the Holocaust, without even being in that collective. Internal bureaucrats hate when people are truly in tune with who they really are. This is why anyone who is weird will be pathologized, and I'm not talking solely about the savant types. Goodness is once again shown when our excess of neurodivergent schizo or generally mentally ill members of society are further kicked while they're down. Be a freedom seeker, a rebel, a fugitive within reason, of course. Find the Luciferian light because runaway slaves were once deemed bad and pathologized with these abattoirs for wanting basic human rights, let alone liberty and sovereignty. Guess what? Those slave masters would have thought they were good people, that what they were doing was okay because someone else did it. Always be weary of the deceit of so-called civilized society.